Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second day of our lecture series on the philosophy of history. Just to give you a little bit of recap of what transpired yesterday, Professor Eric Nelson discussed to us the theory and practice of history in Delphi and the historical school. So basically, in the paper, he tried to explore Delphi's relationship with the historical school by exposing or giving us a critique the various practices by the historical school itself, highlighting the various inequities in its epistemology, in its historiography, and so on and so forth. Now, for today, he will give us a lecture on prophetic temporality, dignity, and the critique of history in Block and Levinas, which will somehow again try to give us a hint on the possible relationship between history and philosophy. So, without further ado, may I once again invite Professor Nelson for his second talk.
Thank you for that introduction. Oh, so here it is. Great. So today's talk will be somewhat different than yesterday's talk, because yesterday we were looking at a historian and how a philosophical historian or a historical philosopher interpreted that practice of history found in Ranke and in the historical school. But today we're going to turn to two philosophers who develop a critical relationship to history. So rather than being within the discipline of history, they want to offer a critique of history in terms of certain notions of time, of temporality, and of the notion of dignity as well. So first off, we have to understand that Ernst Block and Emmanuel Levinas, although they're very different thinkers coming out of different intellectual traditions and schools, they do have a similar question that they're trying to address in at least some of the works that I'll be discussing today. So first off, who is Ernst Block? Well, Ernst Block is a very well-known Marxist philosopher in 20th century Germany. But he's also very famous for being an unorthodox Marxist. And along with Georg Lukács and a number of other figures, he's at the forefront of what is called Western Marxism. And in the 1920s, after the failed communist revolution in Germany in 1919, they developed a new kind of Marxism, which developed into critical theory of the Frankfurt School, for example, on the one hand, but also into this broader category of Western Marxism, with thinkers like Lukács and Bloch trying to rethink the categories of Marx in often more philosophical terms, and in terms that are more appropriate for the 20th century. So along with Lukács and Bloch, another very crucial figure in this movement is Walter Benjamin as well, who was also good friends with the figures in the Frankfurt School. So that's Ernst Bloch. And in today's talk, I'll be focusing on one particular work in particular, and this is Natural Law and Human Dignity, which appeared in German in 1961 and was later published in English and other languages as well. And this is really a classic work of Bloch's thought. And in this work, he traces the natural law tradition in Western philosophy, from its Greek origins, its development with the Stoics, through the Middle Ages and modernity, all the way to the contemporary period. And his interest in natural law is not simply historical. So it's not only a philosophical historiography of natural law, it also has a philosophical significance for him, because it's also a critique of a certain problem within the Marxist tradition as well. So Ernst Bloch poses this question, that Marx in particular is coming out of this natural law tradition, which bases politics and ethical thinking and social thinking in a certain notion of how things ought to be, but at the same time, he rejects that tradition at the same time. And we can see that, for example, in the notion of dignity and how the notion of dignity is treated or mistreated in Marxist and communist movements. So dignity is at the forefront of Marx's writings, especially his early writings. The economic philosophical manuscripts of 1844, they're all about reclaiming human dignity. But at the same time, beginning with Marx, and this is really developed in the so-called communist movements, right? The notion of dignity and human rights are criticized as merely bourgeois liberal values. So the question for Block in this work is, well, is dignity really only a bourgeois liberal value, or is it something constitutive to Marxism itself? Something that needs to be reclaimed so that Marxism is an ethical philosophy as well as a social diagnosis of the present in terms of political, economic, and material conditions. So that's the context from which Ernst Block is developing this thought. So in this work, Natural Law and Human Dignity, he argues that there are two patterns or paradigms in Western political philosophy. One is this natural law tradition that's concerned with a kind of absolute dignity of the person. And this begins with Greek and Roman thought and is extended through Christian thought into the natural law of the early modern philosophers and so on. But then there's another tradition as well that he identifies as the social utopian tradition. And the social utopian tradition is not concerned with dignity as such, but rather with the general well-being and general welfare of the people. It says, how do we, for example, in utilitarianism, maximize the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people? Or in ordinary forms of Marxism, how do we achieve the most amount of well-being for the people? So there's kind of a conflict then within Western political thought, but also within the Marxist tradition between these two tendencies, according to Bloch. There's a natural law emphasis on dignity, and then there's a social utopian emphasis on general well-being and happiness. But these two goals are not always cohesive with one another. And so, for example, for Bloch in the history of 20th century communism, the human dignity has been sacrificed for the sake of social well-being. So people sacrifice themselves in the present for a better future to come. That's the story, right, in the Soviet Union or in the PRC and so on and so forth. But we can question, as Bloch did, whether that is really the case. Whether dignity is something that can simply be bypassed for the sake of general well-being or general happiness. Or whether dignity has to be at the heart of any kind of Marxist revolutionary thinking. And so this work is very interesting and is still relevant today, I think, in the current circumstances of contemporary politics. So it's interesting that although Marxism might generally thought to be social utopian and utilitarian or consequentialist in its thinking, it definitely does have those tendencies, and thus it's opposed to natural law. Bloch wants to show that the revolutionary impulse within Marxism and within history is actually oriented towards this kind of natural law conception. This is what oriented the French Revolution and its demands for justice, for example. They didn't just want to achieve happiness for the people, that's one of the goals they had, but they also wanted to achieve the dignity of being human. And so when the revolutionary traditions forget this concept of dignity, then they undermine themselves. Then they become merely instrumental, calculative. They no longer are concerned with the primary goal of their own motivation, so to speak. So in this sense, Marxism is a continuation, but also maybe disfigures in certain ways, in certain cases, this radical Republican tradition inherited from the French Revolutionary period. So that's Ernst Bloch. So he's posing a fundamental question for our thinking about ethics and politics. Which one should we emphasize? Should we emphasize human dignity, the status of being human, regardless of their conditions, whether economic, racial, or otherwise? Or should we emphasize general well-being, general happiness? And of course, you might want to say, well, of course, we want both of those. But when there's a conflict, which one do you prioritize? So, for example, is it okay to sacrifice certain people to realize general well-being? And of course, the communist movements of the 20th century were very willing to sacrifice parts of the population for this idea of general well-being. And this is something Bloch, even as a Marxist, was critical of. And Bloch is also interesting historically because his Marxism actually led him to go to East Germany after the end of the Second World War. He's one of these leftist German intellectuals who actually tried to join the communist experiment in East Germany, along with Bertolt Brecht. But unfortunately, it didn't work out very well for him, and then he left and went to West Germany, where he lived the rest of his life. But he did spend around over 10 years in the German Democratic Republic. So I just want to note, there's a quotation in German, don't worry, I'll try to explain what it means now, that basically natural law and the revolutionary impulse are concerned then with human uprightness, making humans able to stand up and be dignified in their own being. And this is a tendency we find in early Marx, for example, and so for Block it underlies the Marxian critique of capitalism and of society. And therefore, if the Marxist tradition forgets it, it is in deep peril of misunderstanding itself, but also of becoming brutal or destructive, as Block saw in Eastern Europe in that time. So basically, that's what he's talking about, this new conception of what it is to be human. And of course, the natural law tradition has religious connotations as well that Block is aware of. So one of the problems of natural law is that often in Western political philosophy, it's associated with a certain kind of political conservatism. But Block wants to say, well, even though it's associated with conservatism, its underlying impulse can be radical, can be revolutionary. So this is a very interesting work where he's trying to rehabilitate this concept for kind of a progressive political philosophy of the present. So Block in this work and in other writings on Marx as well focuses on this non-consequentialist, non-utilitarian, non-utopian conception of dignity that's operative in Marx's writings. So if you look at the early writings in particular, we see a certain notion of human dignity in the face of alienation, reification, exploitation, and domination at work. And for Block, this continues throughout the entire project. Even though Marx no longer speaks about this very explicitly in such moral terms in his later works, such as Capital, it's still functional there, according to Block. So Block is one of those thinkers who reads Marx in an ethical way, that there's a basic ethical philosophy underlying Marx's project, and that without it, something very fundamental would be lost. So this tension between dignity and happiness, of course, is found not only in Block's writings about natural law and human dignity in his other works, but also in other philosophers as well. So for example, in the 1940s in China, there was a famous critique of the Communist Party by the social democratic thinker Jiang Junmai, who also argued that one cannot sacrifice dignity, human rights, for the sake of the general welfare of the masses. And so these kinds of arguments are not just ones that occur to Block, but we see them repeated throughout the history of leftist thought, for example, in debates between social democracy and communism. So Jiang is an interesting figure because he helped write the Chinese constitution that was never implemented, that focused on human dignity, human rights, and so on and so forth. So that's just an example of how this plays out in the real world, that these philosophical debates also have real political implications for how society operates. It makes a difference for how you write a constitution, whether you believe in human dignity or whether you think dignity can be sacrificed for the general well-being of the masses or of the people. So all of this has political, social, and constitutional implications, as we see from this Chinese example. So Block's conclusion in this work, Natural Law and Human Dignity, which was published very quickly after his relocation from East Germany to West Germany, so that's also part of this context as well, was basically an unstated, he never says this explicitly in this work, but it's an implicit critique of the state socialisms of Eastern Europe, of the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, but also of the Soviet Union, and that practice of Marxism, which for Block is a fundamental betrayal of the basic ethical impulse, the revolutionary impulse to realize human dignity that we see in Marx's original project. So what this means then is that in Block's argument here, the social utopian demand to attain equality as a general economic well-being had undermined the equal regard for the dignity of each individual subject. So here you see two different ideas and how they work out. One is the idea of the general well-being, the general happiness of the people, that everything should be distributed roughly equally in society. But the other idea is that there should be an equal recognition between individuals that recognizes their personality, their individuality, that they have a certain they have a dignity that underlies a certain set of rights. And so even if it's for the betterment of the general masses, these rights simply can't be sacrificed in a direct or obvious way. So Block is a very interesting Marxist, right? You can see how he's an unorthodox Marxist, a Western Marxist in this sense, that he's arguing for the need for a certain conception of dignity and also a certain set of rights that are guaranteed to the subject, regardless of what the demands of the party or the economic conditions might demand. So he's against simply sacrificing people to current economic necessities. So for him then, and this is the implication of this analysis, communist states have failed to actively maintain a relationship with natural law's anticipation of a just and right form of life in which human dignity would be established. So basically the revolutionary impulse has to be establishing a just and right order in which people can flourish as individuals as well as communities. That is the demand of natural law. And for him, again, it has a progressive political implication. And if progressive or socialist politics forgets this demand, then it falls into mere calculation, to mere instrumentality, and then it can brutalize the people, even in the name of the people itself. So that's the contradiction of the Marxist tradition, according to Block's analysis in this work and in other works from that period after he left East Germany. So dignity then presents us with a certain paradox when we think politically about the role of dignity and happiness in human life. Obviously, we want to have a sense of dignity for ourselves as individuals, as communities, but we also want a sense of happiness as well, right? We want a general well-being. So how do we resolve this aporia, this tension between them? That's an important question. Well, Block, in this 1961 work, Natural Law and Human Dignity, argues that the classic Roman political conception of dignitas, so it comes from Latin. I know some of you have studied Latin, so dignitas is the root of the English word dignity. It did not require the equal worth of human individuals. So when we trace concepts back to their historical origins, we often note that their meaning is different than the meaning they have today. So dignity today is associated with equal rights for all, human rights for all, and so on and so forth. But the historical origin of that concept does not mean that, because only certain elites had dignity. Everyone else lacked dignity. Dignity only belonged to the aristocratic class in the Roman Republic, but then later with certain political figures and religious figures as well. So dignity was a special status. And this is something he points out in this work. So dignitas concern the relative comparative merit and worthiness of persons within a given community and political order. It belonged to certain elites then, whether religious, political, or due to wealth. So dignitas, dignity, was the assertion of a height, of a priority that should not be disturbed by claims of lessers who are intrinsically unequal and should not be given equal consideration. So the original concept of dignity implied radical inequality. So it's very interesting that in discussions of human rights today, everyone talks about equal dignity, but the concept itself doesn't have that origin. The concept of itself points to inequality, that only a few have dignity and everyone else is not important, right? And their claims to equality wouldn't matter in the face of the dignity of the Roman priest or of the Roman patrician, and so on. So dignity in this sense actually continues to exist in the English language. We have certain expressions where people talk about dignity, like the dignity of the office of the president. So in America, in the United States, people say there's that dignity of the office of the president, even if the president has no dignity, as we might see today. But so even if that's the case, right, the office has the dignity. And this is this older kind of status sense of dignity we see in that kind of expression. Or we also see the association of dignity with personal character, that someone maintains dignity despite being insulted, right? So if you're insulted by someone and you're still have your dignity intact, right, you respond in an appropriate way, that's a kind of dignity as well. And those senses of dignity are closer to the older Roman sense of dignity. That's the way you uphold yourself in relationship to others, whether because of an elite status that you have or because of your bearing, right, that you know you are of worth despite the insults that might be thrown at you. So a famous example of this would be Rosa Parks in America. African Americans were not allowed in the front of the bus, but she sat in the front of the bus and all of the angry white people yelled at her, but she maintained her dignity and sat on the bus, right? So that would be an example of that kind of dignity, personal dignity as well. So the concept of dignity, because of this history, has a number of tensions associated with it. And this is something that Block analyzes in Natural Law and Human Dignity. So it was, in particular, in Hellenistic and Roman philosophy, and later Greek and Roman philosophy, especially in Stoicism, in the Stoics, where the concept of dignitas was coupled with another concept, which in Latin is called humanitas, which we call in English humanity. So this association of dignity and humanity is a later, actually, philosophical production. So often we think of certain ideas as natural, but there was some philosopher at some point who thought it up, right? So that shows the importance of philosophy in history to a certain extent. With the Stoics, their influence, or with Marx's influence, for better or worse, and so on, we see how ideas can motivate people and change how they conceive and even experience the world. So it was philosophers who coupled dignity, dignitas, with humanity, humanitas. And basically they did so not in an egalitarian way, but rather in a moralistic way. Because the concept of dignitas is a kind of moral stance cultivated by the sage. So the Stoics and the Hellenistic and Roman philosophers believed in these sage-like figures that are paralleled in some ways to the Chinese or Indian conception of a sage. That's not just philosophizing about the world in a theoretical way, but it's comporting oneself, living life in a particular way. So philosophy originally is a way of living. It's an art of life for the Greeks and the Romans. And so basically dignity then is how the wise maintain themselves in the midst of all the turbulence of the world. And they identified with the basic humanitas that only the sages perfectly realize. So it's the sage who realizes true humanity by maintaining their dignity regardless of the political or social or natural chaos going on around them. So dignity, again, is a kind of stance one has, a bearing one has in a relationship to the circumstances of life in the world. So it's very interesting that the Stoic sense of dignity and humanity is also associated with another concept that becomes very crucial to the tradition of natural law and our modern concept of dignity as well. This is the notion of cosmopolitanism. So the Stoics followed the Cynics. They said, I am not just a citizen of Athens or of Greece, right? I am a citizen of the world. And a citizen of the world is a rough translation of cosmopolis, right? Cosmos is the cosmos. Polis is the community, the political community. But in cosmopolis and cosmopolitanism, the community is the entire universe rather than simply your neighbors in your own community or in your own nation. And so the Cynics and the Stoics believe that the philosopher is cosmopolitan. They're not dedicated just to the life of Greece or Rome, but to humanity, and humanity as identified with the cosmos, not just with a particular nation state. And it's interesting that this Roman idea of humanity, cosmopolitanism, also had a political function in the Roman Empire. So as the Roman Empire increased, they would incorporate all their conquered populations and make them Romans, basically. They were all made into Roman citizens through this process of a certain kind of imperial cosmopolitanism. So there's also a political correlation between the Stoicism of the Roman period and then the Roman Empire and its development. So this Stoic cosmopolitan conception of human dignity is a really important source for the modern egalitarian interpretation of dignity. So we have to keep that in mind too, that when early modern theorists came up with these ideas of dignity, equality, and so on that helped inspire the French Revolution, and then the revolutionary tradition associated with Marxism and so on, they were reinterpreting and reviving these ancient Greek and Roman ideas. So there's a certain historical continuity or a reconnecting with that past that had been degraded to a certain extent. So in this sense, right, dignity is not linked with rank and status. with being an elite or an aristocrat, but rather to a universal property and feature of human beings as such, however it might be defined. So dignity then becomes a universal property of humans. And for the Stoics, it's the philosophers who truly realize this humanity by philosophizing, of course. But in the early modern period, in this new egalitarian spirit, dignity is not associated with just the capacity of the philosopher to think about what it is to be human. It becomes a universal property of all humans. And so there's this growing egalitarianism in the early modern European period that leads up to the radical republicanism of figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and others who helped shape the ideas of the French Revolution. So there are a number of tensions then in the concept of dignity itself, according to Block's analysis that we're considering here. The first tension, or paradox, we might say, is in the historical concept of dignity, is between dignity as rank and dignity as something everyone has equally. So the concept of dignity, I would agree with Block on this, still has this tension between having a certain kind of status associated with it, so that it's not egalitarian at all, and then at the same time we want to have this notion of equal dignity at the same time. But obviously there's a tension between those two ways of thinking about dignity. But there's also a second tension that I want to raise now. It rests in the political, theological conditions of the formation of the concept of an intrinsic dignity belonging to all human beings. So it's linked to a divinely given, inalienable individual rights and the idea of an individual soul. This obviously is the Christianized version of natural law, where you get the idea of a soul, of a personality that is inviolable to a certain extent. So the history of Christianity plays a role in the formation of natural law as well. And that's why contemporary natural law theorists tend to be Christian, Catholic theologians and philosophers. They're trying to rehabilitate natural law thinking even today. So, but at the same time, in the early modern period, they take this basically Christianized Greco-Roman notion of dignity, and then they begin to secularize it. They want to identify it with an inalienable right that is intrinsic to the human being, regardless of whether there is a soul or a divine origin as such. But this too is a kind of tension or even paradox, because the French Revolution, even though it's very anti-Christian in some ways, right? It wanted to overturn the church. At the same time, it's relying on concepts that it has inherited from this Christian tradition. The idea of a person, for example, with inalienable rights, of a certain kind of dignity, regardless of the conditions of life. So we can see this, that there's a certain kind of tension then between the Jewish Christian sources of the concept of dignity, along with the Greek ones and Roman ones we considered, and then its modern realization, or the attempt to realize it. And of course, some people have argued that this is an incoherent project. This is why the French Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution led to terror in the end, because they could not maintain a balance or connection with what natural law states about dignity. So, of course, I've gone over these points somewhat quickly, but that's basically a summary of this work, Natural Law and Human Dignity, which will be the point of the rest of our discussion today. And I just want you to keep in mind then that these two historical and conceptual tensions are potentially very explosive to a coherent interpretation of human dignity even today. Even today, if you read Martha Nussbaum on dignity and cosmopolitanism, or other contemporary thinkers, they're still grappling with these tensions that are built into the genealogy of the concept itself. Because this is how concepts function, right? We just don't have a clear, coherent idea, but they're historically shaped and misshaped and rewritten again and again over time. So they have multiple layers and thus multiple tensions, right, within them. So we just did a kind of conceptual history, right, of conceptual history of the notion of dignity as presented by Block in his work. Now I want to point out the relationship between natural law on the one hand and this notion of prophetic critique that I want to develop today. And I'm going to talk about Eric Nelson, who's not myself, but there's an intellectual historian at Harvard. And sometimes I'm mistaken for him. I've been at conferences and they go, "Oh, I love your book on the Jewish sources of modern egalitarianism." And I'm like, "What? I didn't write a book like that." But anyway, thanks for the compliment. So anyway, he's not a relative of mine either. But this Eric Nelson from Harvard wrote a book called The Hebrew Republic, Jewish Sources and the Transformation of European Political Thought. And I think this is an intellectual historian, cultural historian, who has shown, I think, the continuing interest of Block's analysis. Even though he doesn't repeat Block's analysis, I think some of the conclusion he arrives at can be read in a Blockian way. And that's why I'm mentioning this, because he shows the Jewish and Christian sources of liberalism, republicanism, and the entire political paradigm of modernity. We might call this the political theological conditions of liberalism and republicanism. So further, we see today that there are so-called neo-natural law theorists who still argue for this natural law paradigm. And often they're associated with Catholicism or other Calvinism and other forms of Christian thinking. But they still are arguing for this link between dignity and a certain kind of theology, and they argue that secularizing these concepts only undermines them. That secularization is actually the destruction of human dignity rather than the possibility of its secular realization, as, say, Rousseau or Marx would have thought. So although the political theological idea of dignity is often seen as conservative, right, based on such works, and even reactionary at times, it has a noteworthy role in what could be called prophetic, ethical, and political diagnosis. And I think this is what we see in Block and a certain form of Western Marxism, also in figures such as Walter Benjamin, who relies on these Jewish prophetic sources to develop a Marxist critique of fascism, for example. But also in another continental philosophical tradition of the 20th century as well, we see actually a similar strategy. So the thinkers such as Levinas, Derrida are not Marxists. They're not explicitly, they discuss Marx at times, but they're not committed to a Marxist paradigm. And yet there is a very analogous issue in their ethical thinking as well. And I'll focus on Levinas, but I think the same issue reappears in Derrida and other thinkers as well. So what is a prophetic critique then? Well, prophetic comes from the word prophecy, right? And it refers back to the Old Testament, to the Torah, the prophets who critique the state of Israel as being unjust to the people. So for example, the book of in Isaiah, for example, is a good example. He criticizes the current political conditions and calls people to be just, right? Or experience God's wrath. So this prophetic tradition is very powerful in the Jewish Bible, but also in those traditions that have reinterpreted and used the Jewish Bible to develop their own form of religiosity, such as Christianity or Islam to a certain extent as well. So what is this notion of prophetic critique then? Well, I think in a sense that's a very modern idea, but it's using or appealing to these very ancient Jewish sources, the Jewish prophets. And we see this at work in thinkers like Block and Benjamin related to the Marxist tradition, where you see these Jewish prophetic voices at work in the critique of contemporary capitalist or fascist society, in the case of Benjamin in the 30s. But you also see it in this tradition of Levinas and Derrida as well. A certain notion of critique that's related to a certain notion of prophecy about what is just and what is right or what is good. So basically, prophetic critique then is witnessed in the Jewish prophets. And I think the book of Isaiah is a very good example of that. With all of its radical condemnations of the injustices of the social political order, for the sake of defending, and this is a quote that Levinas uses again and again, and it comes from the book of Isaiah, for the sake of defending widows, orphans, strangers, right? And helping the abject, the lowly, and the oppressed. So this language of helping the widow, the orphan, the stranger, right? All of this comes from the book of Isaiah and other prophetic sources. And of course, anyone who reads Levinas can see the role of that in his thinking. So we have to think then, what is the connection then between what Levinas is doing, who comes out of 20th century German and French phenomenology, and then this older Jewish prophetic sensibility? Well, basically, prophetic critique, in this case, is not meant to be an otherworldly type of critique, just saying be patient and wait for heaven to come, or in the next life, right, whatever that might be. But rather, it's not about another world, but about this world. And we see this kind of radicality in Isaiah himself. Isaiah doesn't say, be good and wait for God, right? He says, no, you should be just now, right? You need to act now to help others, love your neighbor, and so on and so forth. And so we see this in this notion of prophetic critique as well, that it's a critique of the present, right? Of the present way of living, the present way of life. Not for the sake of another world, but for potentially transforming this world that we're now living in. So it's about the here and now. It's about the present. So we can see traces of this kind of sense of prophetic critique in Marx himself, right? There are moments when Marx sounds like an Old Testament prophet, right? Even though he's Jewish, but he's a secular Jewish thinker, so he doesn't rely on religion explicitly. But we still see those resonances in his thought. And likewise, they come to the fore in certain forms of Western Marxism, especially in Ernst Block's thinking, as we begin to see, and also in Walter Benjamin. We should talk more thoroughly about some other time. He's very interesting as well. But we also find it in the quasi or post-phenomenological ethics of Levinas, of Derrida, but also very interestingly in what's called liberation theology, the liberation philosophy. So there's a very well-regarded Latin American liberation philosopher named Enrique Dussel. Some of you might have heard of him. And he engages with Levinas and Block in a post-colonial way as a critique of the present post-colonial or quasi-colonial order. So he's a very interesting philosopher to look at in this regard for a critique of a kind of quasi-colonial or post-colonial condition or situation. So we'll go back and stay with these earlier thinkers, but you're very welcome to go read Dussel sometime as well. I recommend that. So what then is prophecy? Well, prophecy is very interesting as a phenomenon because it's also a temporal one. It's related to time in a very important way. Because prophecy is about what is to come, right? It is about the avenir, right? What is to come, the future, the futural. But it's a different kind of future. So we can say there's a planned future that we calculate. So you plan to have dinner tonight, right? You plan to get up and go to school or to work tomorrow, whatever it might be. That's the planned future that we rely upon. But there's also the future that we don't plan that simply happens, right? That kind of interrupts our plans, our expectations, our anticipations. And this is a sense of the prophetic time that these thinkers are getting at. It's something that interrupts the present, interrupts our plans for the future, right? That we didn't expect at all. And of course, a revolutionary transformation of society would be precisely for these thinkers of that kind of character. So prophecy is a question of time, of temporality. So while orthodox or conservative political, theologically oriented natural law theory appeals to, I would say, a standard, fairly standard sense of the divine and the eternal as super or non-temporal properties, underwriting an inalienable dignity and rights, right? So this is part of that tradition that they appeal to a certain sense of God or a divine order that underwrites human rights. So for example, in the American Declaration of Independence and Constitution, there's this idea of the inalienable rights of humanity given by God. So that's kind of standard natural law thinking. But in this counter tradition or other tradition that is related to natural law but not in this conservative way, prophetic ethics and critique appears to have a distinctive understanding of the importance of prophetic and what might be called messianic temporality for the question of justice. So often people speak of the messianic moment in Walter Benjamin and Levinas and Derrida, but I'm going to call it the prophetic because I think that's slightly different and more precise. So let's briefly consider now 3 examples of prophetic temporality in outline, and we'll talk about 2 of them in further detail, and one I'll just mention in passing. So I want to briefly describe Walter Benjamin and his notion of prophetic temporality to give you a sense of what Block is doing in his writings. So in this very important essay, late essay of Walter Benjamin on the concept of history, so again, we're talking about the philosophy of history here, right? Walter Benjamin elucidates how there is a weak messianic power. He calls it the weak messianic power. And this weak messianic power disrupts or interrupts the linear, homogeneous, empty time of the historical present in the immediacy of the now time. So there's a now time is this radical experience of the present as present that interrupts the homogeneous linear time that we usually experience in our everyday life. So time often seems to be simply a linear sequence of moments, one after the other. That's our usual experience of time. But here we have a radically different experience of time, that everything comes immediately to us in all of its potentiality. And this for him is a messianic moment. But Benjamin doesn't believe that the Messiah will literally appear in this moment, right? Because he's a Marxist, not a a Jewish theologian. Yet he's using this Jewish religious idea in a Marxian way to say that there is this interruptive moment in which we can reorient ourselves and reorient our stance towards life. So this is a kind of prophetic temporality that can be used then as a critique of the present, right? Because the now time would do justice to the living as well as the dead, right, by redeeming their aspirations, he writes. So for him, in the now time, in the revolutionary moment, we can redeem not just the aspirations of ourselves, but the aspirations of all those who have come before us and suffered all of these injustices as well. So there is a kind of secularized political theology going on in Benjamin's argument here, even though he's using it for Marxist purposes against the existing fascism of that time, against National Socialism. So for him, weak messianic time is revolutionary time. But if you think simply that a Messiah will actually come, then that's not revolutionary time, because then you're just waiting for some other right to appear, some other worldly event. But if you take that messianic moment, right, and understand it in a political way, social political way, then it becomes revolutionary time. So there's an intrinsic relation for Benjamin between this Jewish messianic temporality on the one hand and the Marxist sense of revolution on the other. And this is something he contrasts with the fascist notion of time in this and other works from that period. So that's one Western Marxist way of reading prophetic temporality. But there's another one we see at work in Ernst Block, and this plays an important role for Levinas as well, even though Levinas is not a Marxist. But he reads Block in a very interesting way on this question. So Ernst Block, likewise bringing together Marxism and what we might call religious mysticism, right, based in this Jewish tradition, to interpret radically interruptive and transformative time. And it's interesting, he does this beginning with a very early work called The Spirit of Utopia that he published in 1918 at the end of the First World War. So even then, he has a certain sense of the religiosity of revolution in his work, that there's a utopian spirit that can be used to confront the existing injustices of our day, of our time. So he wrote this work, The Spirit of Utopia, the first version of it in 1918, in this context of the defeat of Germany in the First World War, and then this communist revolution that was happening with Rosa Luxemburg and other figures in 1918, 1919 in Germany. And basically there he already articulates a very interesting notion of temporality that is not simply the conventional Marxist one. Because he talks about a temporality of hope. And in his later works he calls this the temporality of the not yet, the noch nicht. And this not yet can be used to challenge and counter the present existing order, to throw it into question. So what does not exist can be used to question what does exist. How is this possible, right? Well, there's a certain notion of radical temporality, that if temporality has this radical quality, we can use the radicality of temporality, this prophetic temporality, to question the existing history in which we live in, the existing time in which we exist in, and so on. So this basic revolutionary impulse, right, in Block begins in his earliest works and becomes the task of his later works as well. So what then about Levinas? How does Levinas fit into this picture of rethinking time in a radically prophetic way? Well, I want to turn to certain different notions of time in Levinas, because he has different accounts of time in different works to show what he's getting at. So for example, in his 1947 work, written after the Second World War, Existence and Existence, Levinas thematizes the time of the instant, of the moment, right? So again, there's a focus on this moment, the instant, in which everything seems possible, which is revealed, however, not simply as a revelation of possibilities for Levinas, as, for example, in other thinkers, but rather, here there's a very different phenomenological or existential analysis going on. Because he says this instant, the bare, naked moment, is experienced not as hope or something, anticipation or something like that, but rather it's experienced in the night, in insomnia. So when you're unable to sleep all night long, right? You're shaking and trying to sleep and you cannot, maybe you're sweating or whatever. In that pure anxiety of insomnia, right? This is when the moment, the instant is revealed to you. So there's a certain nature of time that is revealed to you through the experience of insomnia. So likewise in this next work right after that, in 1948, he wrote a work called Time and the Other. Levinas contends there, or he contests there, the identification of time with the identity or continuity of a substance and subjectivity in the self. So in classical Western philosophy, time is the duration of the subject of a substance. That's what it is associated with. But here Levinas wants to contest the notion of time as identity, as continuity. So what is time then? Well, time is here presented as intrinsically coming from the other person. So time is not derived from ourself, from our sense of subjectivity or our substance, but rather comes in the encounter with the other person. And in the other person, this is where we experience temporality, what temporality actually is. And that's because the other is temporally and ethical prior to my own self. So you begin to see how he's developing this ethics of the other, even in these early quasi-existentialist works of the 1940s. Even though it's not fully an ethics of the other here, he's already going in that direction. He's going in that direction, and it's based on an interpretation of time, of temporality. A certain notion of interruption, of the moment, right? But also of time coming from the other rather than from the self, from non-identity rather than from identity. So in these works and in later works of Levinas, time is examined as exposure, exteriority, diachrony, transcendence. Yet time is also not only described in these existential or quasi-existential terms or phenomenological terms, time is also described using a prophetic language, which is what I want to focus on in this talk today. And this is the time of the future, the avenir, which is interpreted as what is to come, avenir. So it's a play on the French word, which Derrida picks up as well in some discussions. So this what is to come, right? The future is what is to come, haunts the present existing moment. So here again, we have a sense of time that goes beyond our ability to plan, to anticipate, to expect what is to come. This is the unplanned time, right? So this points to a certain extent to prophetic temporality that we'll look at further now. So now let's turn to this notion of prophetic temporalities that I'm using to interpret Block and Levinas. So I won't discuss the case of Benjamin, which is very interesting as well due to time, or other thinkers who think of time in these terms. But let's focus on Block's not yet and Levinas's to come, right? Which have been adopted by more later philosophers such as Derrida and Dussel. So prophetic ethics, right, is derived in a broad way from this sense of prophetic temporality. So now I want to go from prophetic temporality to the sense of ethics that we should have given that prophetic sense of time that is being presented in the works of Block and Levinas. Now I'll continue to mention how this is a critique of history at the same time. So prophetic ethics appears to be distinct from the natural law tradition, even though it's related to it in a number of ways, namely through the religious context of both, or the political theological context of both, in at least two ways. First, it is temporal rather than non-temporal. And its temporality is unstable and non-linear, interrupting natural historical time, interrupting our ordinary sense of history, and problematizing the existing political order of things rather than justifying a stable normative order. So this is one of the ways in which this prophetic temporality, this prophetic ethics, differs from standard natural law. It's about temporality rather than about atemporality. It challenges the existing order rather than justifies the existing order. Likewise, to a certain extent, in a larger or broader sense, it is materialist, and being primarily concerned with the suffering, the injustices, the material life, and human sensibility. So rather than talking about the soul or the intrinsic ideal of a person as a non-material principle, or some other kind of posited spiritual entity, it talks about the human body, the vulnerability, the suffering of the human body. So we have a focus not on the person as soul or some other ideal spiritual state, but rather on the actual physical human organism, the suffering, the injustice, the misfortunes that are inflicted upon it. So both in Levinas and Block, there's a concern with the real suffering of human subjects. So it's about time and it's about suffering, right? Those are two ways in which it diverges from standard natural law theory, as the other Eric Nelson talked about. Right? So what then is this dialectic of dignity? How should we consider it in light of how Levinas and Bloch consider time? Well, there are a number of questions we can pose at this point, and hopefully I'll try to answer some of them, but I probably won't be able to answer all of them. So we'll have to think about it further after this event. So first, does a prophetic ethics indicate a genuine alternative, or simply a supplement in desperate times that people were living in, say in the Second World War? Or is it merely historical curiosity with regard to dignity and human rights, right? So does this kind of prophetic ethics in the form of Levinas or Bloch or Dussel or Derrida continue to speak to the present or not? Are the temporality and materiality of human existence compatible with a full or adequate conception of human dignity, or do they undermine it? So from a standard natural law perspective, this is insufficient to ground human dignity, which requires not just a weak messianic power, but a full religious sensibility. And third, we should also ask this question: doesn't any form of Marxism, even in the unorthodox versions of Benjamin or Bloch, or the interpretations of their thinking of temporality unfolded in Derrida or Levinas, prove to be incompatible with human dignity? So is Marxism compatible with human dignity? So those are some questions we'll consider for the next part of the talk and for our conclusion today. So let's consider these issues, these questions in reverse order now. I'll begin backwards. I always go backwards often. So Levinas's most hostile critics reject his thought as that of a conservative, believing Jew, as being overly religious, and even some say he's a Zionist ideologue who ignores Palestinian alterity and suffering, despite the primacy of the ethical in his own discourse. So we have to consider the critics of Levinas as well, whether this paradigm or model Levinas is offering is adequate to thinking about dignity and the human suffering today. So I want to mention Zizek as a typical example of that kind of critique of Levinas. So if you read any of Zizek's writings about Levinas, it's all this kind of stuff. He's conservative, he's religious, he's Zionist, don't read him, right? But I think this is a really bad misinterpretation of Levinas, and it's really unfair to Levinas as well. So I just mentioned it to show you that there is this, critique of Levinas going on. And so Zizek and Badiou as well say this. They think that Levinas and Derrida, their ethics of the other, is simply kind of an empty moralistic posturing, right? So you can see that kind of critique developed in other continental thinkers. But I want to justify or defend what Levinas and Derrida are doing today. So there are other critics, of course, like Kegel or Critchley, right? And they also want to criticize Levinas's thinking as a kind of limited form of republicanism. So Levinas clearly comes from this French Republican tradition, and Critchley and Kegel identify that as a limiting condition as opposed to a opening up one. But I think maybe they misinterpret what republicanism means in this context. So in the Anglo-American world, republicanism usually means a kind of conservatism, right? Like the Republican Party in the United States, which is clearly not revolutionary or radical in any way. But in the European tradition, republicanism is associated with Rousseau and the French Revolution and the French Republic that wanted to institute what? Free liberty, equality, fraternity, which we now call solidarity to be less sexist, right? So these are the values of French republicanism. So I think Anglo-American critics of Levinas often miss the radical side of republicanism, both historically and in Levinas's works as well. And so when you think of Levinas in terms of politics, you should read him in relationship to this French Republican tradition, but not as a conservative in that tradition, but as a potentially radical thinker in that tradition. So I want to save the kind of radical potential of Levinas here. Why? Well, basically because Levinas's political and ethical thinking relies on two sources. One is this Jewish prophetic tradition. So he too appeals to the book of Isaiah, for example. The other is this kind of Rousseauian Republican tradition that he gets from moving to France and integrating with French society. So Levinas's republicanism has Jewish prophetic sources, as we've seen. It also has Rousseauian sources. So it's highly informed by the progressive French Republican tradition of liberty, fraternity, equality, right? In contrast to pathological nationalist forms of republicanism that Hannah Arendt analyzes, for example. So I think Arendt is very helpful here because she points out in The Origins of Totalitarianism how republicanism is both a revolutionary idea when it's applied in a kind of egalitarian way, but then it's also a nationalist movement as well. So after the Dreyfus Affair was, of course, the critique of the French Republic as allowing a multi-ethnic society, undermining French values, and so on and so forth. But afterwards, French republicanism itself took on a kind of conservative and in some cases fascistic overtones. And of course, we see this in Italian fascism and National Socialism as well. So Arendt argues in her Origins of Totalitarianism that once republicanism becomes nationalistic, it leads into fascism. But she herself points out that there is this other side of republicanism, this radically internationalist, egalitarian side of republicanism that emphasizes not just a limited national community, but solidarity, equality, liberty. So again, the Republican tradition then is multifaceted. And if we think about which side of the Republican tradition Levinas belongs to, it's clearly the radical side of this division. He's not a French nationalist, right? He's a critic of French nationalism and of fascism. And so when he speaks in Republican language, what words does he use? Well, he speaks exactly of the revolutionary three principles, right? Liberty, equality, fraternity. So that's the language he's using, and he's not limiting that language to an ethnocentric community of just the French or of the Jewish people, for example. So to that extent, I think a number of these critiques of Levinas are unfair or miss the point of his thinking. So there's also an interesting relation between Levinas and Marxism, which will lead us to Levinas's interpretation of Block and to our conclusion. So Levinas's thinking is not Marxist, of course. He's not a Marxist. He's trained in phenomenology with Husserl and Heidegger. He's interested in existentialism and Jewish religion and so on and so forth. But at the same time, he has a complex relationship with Marxism, and he's not entirely antagonistic to it, as I want to show today. So for example, Levinas's writings contain certain Marxist moments and even sympathetic readings of Marx and Ernst Block, right? That's why I picked Block and Levinas today. And adopting an argument that he found in authors such as Block and Marcuse as well, he argues that there is a repressed yet latent humanistic dimension of all forms of Marxism, including even Soviet communism. So Marcuse has this very famous book, 1958, Soviet Marxism, A Critical Analysis, where he says that it's a disaster, of course. It's totalitarian, it's brutal, but the implicit structure of the idea of Marxism still has this basic humanistic core to it, despite whatever communist parties have done to it. And this is an idea we find in Block as well, and this is something that Levinas actually argues in the 50s as well. So it's really strange because he publishes this article in Esprit, which is a liberal anti-communist magazine, right? It's not pro-Marxist at all. It's a liberal magazine that is very critical of communism in that period during the Cold War. And there he talks about Soviet internationalism and the moral kind of capacity that it has, despite all of the deformations that the Soviet Union has undergone through the terror and the totalitarianism, the camps, and so on and so forth. So even in an essay like this, he can identify a certain impulse towards human dignity within the Marxist and communist tradition, which is very atypical for a French conservative. And my argument would be, well, he's not a French conservative. This is why he's making this argument. It's also interesting that he sides here with the Soviet Union against China, and they're split with one another in this essay, but I won't go into that here. So we can ignore some of the ethnocentric problems in that essay. Like in my book, I talk about his misunderstanding of China and how he interprets the Chinese world. But basically here he's, in this essay, even though he says there's a latent humanism in any form of communism, he still says there's a kind of problem. There's a certain paradox in Marxism between the realization of human dignity and the destruction of human dignity. And this is very interesting that even though he hasn't read Ernst Block yet explicitly, he doesn't talk about Block here or in this period, that comes up later, he's already close to Block in a certain way of analyzing Soviet communism. So on the one hand, he says there is this Marxist notion of dignity that we find in Marx's writings and in the ethical side of the Marxist tradition. So, for example, for Levinas, Marx's writings affirm individual and social flourishing and the radical demand for the realization of human happiness, but also the self-worth for the abject and the oppressed. So for Levinas, Marx stands in this prophetic tradition, right, to a certain extent. But he doesn't completely stand within it, right? He has the source, but on the other hand, there's another dimension to Marx as well that Block was also concerned with. And this is that the Marxist critique of dignity as merely being a bourgeois liberal value that we don't really need is deeply problematic, right? Why? Well, because it's supposed to operate against the notion of dignity as rank. So the Marxist critique of dignity is supposed to say there are no people of special rank, of special dignity, and so on and so forth. Everyone is equal. So that's the kind of egalitarian impulse to reject a certain notion of dignity. But notice what it's doing. It's rejecting the older senses of dignity found in the Roman tradition, where dignity is associated with a certain elite status. But by rejecting that side of dignity, they unfortunately also reject the other side of dignity, which is that each person has this intrinsic self-worth. So the problem with the Marxist critique of dignity is that it throws out the whole concept rather than rejecting simply the elitist or aristocratic side of it. So instead of rejecting all of human dignity, it should just critique certain aspects of dignity that lead to inequality. So that's the problem with the Marxist critique of dignity as Levinas sees it, which is very much akin to Block, right? So you can see how already at this period, Block and Levinas have certain thoughts that are correlating, and we're going to see that more fully when Levinas begins reading Block and talking about it in this later lecture course that we'll get to soon called, it has a great title, God, Death, and Time. All the big questions. So Marxist discourses, we might conclude from this analysis of Block and Levinas, have a certain ambiguous relationship with the notion of dignity and what dignity is in human history. How so? Well, on the one hand, the universal achievement of dignity, right, has been seen as the goal of social historical development and of revolutionary struggles for the oppressed by various Marxist thinkers. So there is a role for dignity in Marxism, right? But it's ambiguous because that notion of dignity is also criticized and even rejected completely in other forms of Marxist discourse, or even in the same ones at times. So on the other hand, dignity has also been critiqued and rejected as a reactionary bourgeois residue of metaphysical and theological thinking. So they identify dignity with the older Roman understanding, the Stoic understanding, the natural law tradition as establishing a certain kind of elite or conservative understanding of what it is to be a person with dignity. So that's the object of critique by Marxist theorists, but it goes too far in completely rejecting the notion of dignity as such. So that's the problem. It has dignity to a certain extent, but undermines dignity in very strong ways that lead to a very bad form of political practice, at least according to Block and Levinas. Because the history of course, Soviet communism and other forms of communism has been very destructive, right, for the masses of people who've been afflicted in the name of progress. So for Block, then, Marx's critique of the dignity signifies the critique of its inadequate realization rather than the elimination of individual dignity for the sake of collective development. That again can be found in this work, Natural Law and Human Dignity. He says the problem of dignity is not that we need to get rid of it because it's bourgeois, but we have to more fully and completely realize it as the fulfillment of Marx's project. So that's how Block wants to reinstate dignity at the core of Marx's thinking against state forms of socialism that undermine human dignity. So let's turn now to some reflections on Block and Levinas leading towards our conclusion. So I proposed here an outline reconsidering the work of these two thinkers who link dignity with the temporality and materiality and suffering of human life. So we see certain connections between Block and Levinas. And it's very interesting that Levinas himself will take this up in this lecture course, God, Death, and Time, where he devotes a number of chapters to dealing with Block's thought. So in this paper, we've traced, hopefully, how the works of Block and Levinas have offered two interpretive strategies for connecting the ethical, political demand for dignity on the one hand, and human rights, with the temporal, sensuous, bodily character of human existence on the other hand. So this notion of dignity is not associated with the soul or simply a personality outside of the body, but with the suffering, vulnerable body itself, which is an element that Block and Levinas both highlight in their thinking. So the two primary sources I've used in this interpretation, again, just to remind you in summary, are Block's work, Natural Law and Human Dignity. And you can also see a fuller development of this kind of thinking in The Principle of Hope that's published in 3 volumes. And it's these works that Levinas will discuss in this lecture course that I've mentioned already, God, Death, and Time. And these are actually 2 lecture courses that Levinas gave during his last years in the Sorbonne in 1975-76, and he published in 1982 in French. So this is a fairly late work of Levinas. They're based on 2 lecture courses where he critiques, for example, Heidegger on death, but then he turns to Block on death. So let's talk about that before we get to our conclusion. So in the latter chapter, Levinas reflects on dignity in the context of human temporality and human mortality, that we're going to die, right? The fact that we will die. And Block provides, he argues here, a more adequate way of conceiving this nexus of time and death than Heidegger does, who for Levinas prioritizes one's own death and one's mastery over death rather than the death of the other person and the dignity of the other precisely in material moments of suffering and death. So for Levinas, he critiques Heidegger's notion of death. Heidegger famously wrote that we're being towards death, and that we're always concerned with death to a certain extent, even if we don't realize it or think about it in a reflective way. But Levinas is critical of this idea of death in Heidegger because he says it's egotistical. It refers back to oneself, basically. But death is not so much about myself, my own death, it's the concern for the other's death. That's how death primarily moves me. I'm more concerned about my friend, my loved one dying than I am about my own self dying for Levinas. So there's more of an ethical attitude about death in Levinas, which suggests that Heidegger's conception is inadequate. But it's not just ethical, it's also a certain sense of temporality as well. So remember that in the 1940s, Levinas argued that time comes from the other. But also our sense of death, right, the gift of death, so to speak, comes from the other as well. The only way we understand death and mortality is not through our own self, our own ego, but rather through the death and suffering of others. But for Levinas, it's precisely in perceiving, seeing the other die or suffer, and responding to that suffering, to their dying, right, to their mortality, that you see this prophetic ethics in motion. Because if we were mere, we could be indifferent to the death of others, right? People could die and we'll say, be totally unconcerned with it. But for Levinas, we're primarily moved by the death of the other. If we see suffering, right, our impulse is to respond. If we see someone dying, our impulse is to comfort that person. So there's a kind of ethics of death that points towards our temporality, but also our fundamental relatedness to other figures, other persons, and to the face of the other. So it's precisely in these moments of suffering, the vulnerability, the materiality of the other that ethics occurs. This is the ethical moment, right? And in a sense, it's a prophetic ethics because we have no expectation of what is to come, but we reach out and try to help the other person in that moment of death, for example, of dying. So my argument here today is that these works can be situated in the larger context of their thinking, of their thought. So Block and Levinas have both unfolded the social, political significance of the interruptive and reorienting temporality of the prophetic. And they both use this to critique history as it has been seen and experienced up until now, the history of the present, for example. So history is often seen as a realm of conformity, of death and suffering for them. And so this kind of time interrupts that sense of history, the oppressiveness of history, we might say. So There's a similar strategy then, as I've been saying, but there are some differences at the same time. So Block has this strategy, he articulates it in terms of the anticipation of historically imminent and revolutionary concrete utopia of hope and the realization of human dignity. So the utopianism of Marxism should be focused not on mere happiness, but on the reestablishment of dignity. That is what orients any kind of transformational impulses. We want to change the world, not just to be happy, but we want to change the world because we are shaped by hope, by what is not yet. Because if we merely wanted to be happy, we would just go out and play, right? We wouldn't work for transformation. But it's hope that allows us to try to make the situation better, not just for ourselves, but for others as well. So you can see how Block's notion of time, and prophetic ethics is still related to the Marxian tradition in general, right? But this is different in Levinas. Levinas is related to this more phenomenological, existential tradition of the 20th century. And so for Levinas, it occurs through the infinite, asymmetrical, yet not hierarchically superior responsibility that one has to the other's vulnerable, sensible existence and their suffering. So in seeing the suffering other, I feel myself responsible to the other. I feel compelled to address, to respond to the other. So this is that ethical moment. So for Levinas, ethics is not based merely on conceptual thinking or analysis. It's based in this real face-to-face encounter that I have with the other person and the demands that the other person has on me. Not that the other person tells me what to do, right? It's not that, but I see the other's pain, their dying, right? Their mortality, and then I respond to that, right? I'm called to respond to that. So you can see also in Levinas how this Jewish prophetic thinking is reinterpreted in a kind of contemporary ethical political framework. So to that extent, both Block and Levinas are taking a kind of Jewish prophetic insight, but then reinterpreting it for our own times, right? For our own interpretation of ourselves as temporal beings, as material beings, but also beings who hope and want a better world for ourselves and for those who are to come in the future as well. So now I'm at my conclusion, so thank you very much for holding out until now. We're almost done. So this finite temporal material life, right, that we see articulated in Block and Levinas in different ways, is thought by neo-natural law thinkers to entail the elimination of human dignity. So they reject the kind of analysis that we see in Levinas or Derrida or Block and Benjamin. That's inadequate for them because what is required is a full natural law conception of the person to underlie human dignity and human rights. So the other side of this is that there's a problem of the reduction of validity to facticity, of universal natural law to positive historical law. This is why natural law theorists would reject historicism of the kind that we talked about yesterday, but also why Levinas and Block would be critical of that kind of approach to history as well, because they want to see a kind of normative or prophetic order that can disrupt our current sense of things. Interrupt it, transform it, reorient it. That's what the emphasis is on here. And of course, the natural law theory has that to a certain extent as well, that we can use natural law theory to critique societies or political orders that fall away from the moral laws given by God or whatever they might be. So we might ask whether this is the case, whether the natural law or neo-natural law critique of Block and Levinas or Benjamin and Derrida and so on is adequate, right? Is that the case, that this is a good enough critique? So the question then is, can natural law be naturalized in the sense of being linked to material sensuous existence? So is the ethics of natural law simply bound up with the soul, the eternal soul, or can we say that this kind of prophetic ethics is bound up with the material, temporal, finite human being? So these are deep philosophical questions to be asking at this point, right? But they also have very important political and social implications at the same time. What you consider to be true about this will lead to a very different, say, ordering of society and political implications for how we interact with each other ethically and politically. So these questions are not only philosophical, they're also very practical at the same time. So if Block and Levinas are correct, right? And I think they are to a certain extent, as I've argued today, then I would like to say that this strategy that they have of using prophetic temporality rather than eternal atemporality, of using prophetic ethics rather than natural law ethics, does not eliminate, but rather is a better foundation for the idea of human dignity. So in my conclusion, I'm kind of challenging the natural law theorists, including the person with my same name, Eric Nelson, by arguing for this other approach to dignity and human rights that is based in these religious foundations, but it's given a secular or a more worldly interpretation in these thinkers of the 20th century. So what this means then is that sensuous existence proves to be dignity's very condition rather than eliminating it. It calls for a prophetic critique of the inhuman and inhumane conditions and the fulfillment of claims to human dignity. So if it's true, right, a ideal person or a soul does not require this ethics of vulnerability, of materiality, but because we are fragile, material, sensuous beings, this is precisely why we're called to affirm the dignity of the other person, even in those very worldly, fragile conditions. So these are the very conditions of ethics itself. This is where ethics has to be lived. It's because the other suffers and dies that I'm called to respond to the other and care for them, to see that they get a piece of bread if they're starving, or whatever else it might be. So I think to this extent, Block and Levinas are providing a more adequate model for how to think about ethics in relationship to dignity that can ground things like our notion of human rights without appealing to an external, transcendent, divine order or something like that. So thank you very much for your time today, for listening to this talk. I hope you found it interesting, even if it was abstract at times. And if you're interested, I'm actually publishing a book later this year, early next year, called Levinas, Adorno, and the Ethics of the Material Other. So this is an early version of a chapter that will appear near the end of that book. So you're very welcome to look at that book next year when it appears. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you for that very enlightening and wonderful talk, Professor Nelson. I really learned a lot. I like the way that you presented these thinkers, well, particularly Derrida, because I did Derrida for my undergraduate thesis and as one of my research interests. Now, without further ado, may I now call our first discussant for today, who will respond to the lecture, Professor Adonis Alumbra of the history, to represent the history discipline.
Let me preface this short discussion paper by stating that inasmuch as we are honored and delighted to have the distinguished scholar, Professor Eric Nelson, provide a lecture to our university, I am likewise thrilled by the idea of what I'd call disciplinal encounters. There's been much talk about interdisciplinarity and its related terms over the decades, but it is interesting to note that such a discursive space is becoming narrower and narrower given the monstrosity of what Syed Farid Alatas calls the academic division of labor. To the strict adherents of disciplinarity, there are simply topics that essentially belong to just one discipline. Surely a topic like human dignity can be shared not only among historians and philosophers, but also among anthropologists looking at cultural integrity, among economists asking about measures for quality of life, among biologists perhaps concerned with genetic manipulation or sustainability, among humanists examining the aesthetics and expressions of dignified living. I'm saying this to assert a point that we can all be part of this conversation and that our disciplinal backgrounds are meant to enable us, not limit us in our intellectual pursuits. But for today's session, let's just focus on history and philosophy. This is one of those occasions in recent time when we at the department are looking at the connections of our disciplines. We therefore extend our appreciation to Professor Nelson once again for making this a possibility. We also thank our much younger colleagues in the discipline of philosophy, led by Professor Kelly Agra, who will also speak later, for spearheading this exchange. In the interest of time, my repose will broadly focus on situating number one, human dignity in intellectual history, and number two, temporality in Western historiography. My plane is certainly different from that of Professor Nelson or perhaps Professor Agra later, as I am coming from the disciplines of history and international studies. But I think that's precisely the point of this interface or encounter, to bring about fresh insights, hopefully, through this dialogue and collective introspection from different planes of understanding. What Professor Nelson revealed in today's lecture on dignity is revelatory of the kind of interrogation needed in what typically passes as common sense knowledge. Modern political and development discourses are laced with the word dignity as if it's a constant across time. To cite an instance, in one of the courses that I teach at the graduate level, our class does an exercise on rereading the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this very important document actually begins with the line, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. How then were the likes of Ernst Block and Emmanuel Levinas invested in reasserting the value of dignity if it were a constant and a disagreeable human value? Who would be against it and why? Part of the answer lies in the intellectual history of dignity. By intellectual history, we mean the creation, reception, and transmission of ideas over time. Dignity apparently has a long, conflicted history, one that stretches back to the Roman idea of dignitas, which then meant prestige, certainly hierarchical and way different from our common sense understanding of the concept today. This was consistent with the 19th century Catholic Church's use of the word dignity to mean non-equality among men. What Bloch and Levinas articulated as counter-narratives, as presented by Professor Nelson, are responses to a discursive space that eschews hierarchy and, by extension, the very notion of dignity itself back then. Even Karl Marx was traditionally thought to be against dignity precisely because of its bourgeois conception of an individualizing project of a self-made human being. As an aside, even Arthur Schopenhauer was said to have lashed out on the purveyors of the idea of dignity of men. Among them was Immanuel Kant. Both Bloch and Levinas were connected to Marxism, albeit in varying degrees. Both were humanistic in their leftist or progressive orientations and were critical towards the orthodoxies of Marxism. In the case of Bloch, who was openly Marxist compared to Levinas, he challenged his own left party in East Germany for its Stalinist or its authoritarian tendencies. In the case of Levinas, who, as Professor Nelson describes, is not a Marxist but had sympathetic readings of Marx and even Bloch, he put to question Maoism rather, and stated preference over Russian internationalism. Parochialism, I think, for them, was perhaps antithetical to human dignity too. Their interjections, I agree with the speaker, can be seen not as departures from the said ideology, but as discursive negotiations to make the idea of dignity consistent with Marxist precepts. What intellectual history can probably add as an insight is that aside from the larger philosophical context of their thought, both thinkers were also coming from their own historical contexts during the Nazi regime in Europe, no? Which probably explains their critique of what was said a while back, inhumane conditions, and their espousal of human dignity as an alternative. Their respective challenges to dominant or dominating varieties of Marxism may also be seen from this slide. The other major theme in the lecture of Professor Nelson concerns the strategies of Bloch and Levinas in achieving human dignity. He offers us the concept of prophetic temporality, as a way of synthesizing the different yet connected sensibilities about time of both thinkers. This to him is a critique of history as well. Prophetic temporality, from my understanding, is concerned with the future and is a way of questioning past and present social orders. History indeed is a rather different notion of time. The mainstream idea about writing the past is still to write the past as it actually was. In connection with yesterday's lecture, this was the famous 19th century Rankian mantra of V.S. I can't give sin. But this has changed across the 20th century. That's the German, by the way, for the past as it was. That has changed across the 20th century. Benedetto Croce, for example, would assert that all history is contemporary history, which means to say that our views of history are mediated by our present concerns. When Ferdinand Brodel and the Annales School came to the picture, historical temporality shifted away from a unilinear trajectory to a plurality of time. That is, a historical event should be seen as happening simultaneously within geographic, social, and political times. The implication of these points is that from the perspective of historiography, or the study of how histories are written, temporality is also a changing construct defined by an epistemic community at a given point. Surely, prophetic temporality may serve as another way of organizing our sense of time, or non-organizing our sense of time, as it was referred to a while back as unplanned future. It serves well as a critique too. This is because history, I think, as a discipline, has a way of automating human experience. While historians often assert the particularities of events past, our narratives directly or indirectly limit the possibilities of thinking about potentialities in human action. In other words, what can or cannot be done is found in history. What exists outside history is simply unthinkable. In response to this is the supposed promise of prophetic temporality. For Block to radically work and hope for a future that radicalizes human dignity, and for Levinas to be responsible to the other for what is to come. Limiting as it may have been, however, I also like to believe that historians can also create possibilities of thinking about human action. With all its baggage, history remains conscious of its temporal standpoints. Aside from Croce and Brodel, more and more historians at present endeavor a study of history rather, that projects into the future. This recent trend seems